To make kids, you need
The magic sticks.
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't build wall. I just own a operate a seawall.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words.
Our level of tech is growing by the day.
My new headphones have got this felt fabric, and I'm previously used to that faux leather stuff.
Yeah, speak for yourself, mine's real leather.
How many cows had to die for your listening pleasure?
Just the cow anus is like the perfect shape. So just like two, I suppose. One anus per year. How'd you feel about our last episode?
Looking at it a week later, I sort of thought, we went a little bit soft in some areas, and then wish there was a couple of things raised maybe around some of the classic parts of scripture where they basically say, "Thou shalt be stoned to death if you tick boxes X, Y, and Z." And if there are still people today propagating that, not relevant. And if you still believe in it, and if that still guides your life in any way, you need to snap out of it.
I think so. I think it's all right to call that. You always feel a bit strange confronting people on their beliefs, especially something as important as religion. And I think we were. I think we got the tone right. One thing that I was thinking of, a bit on the lines of the banana video, basically it's the intelligent creator argument where they're like, there must be a creator because these things are so well designed, and they always bring up the human eye, right? They're like, look at this human eye. It's so incredible and so complex. It can't have just evolved by random, mutations. It's amazing. And, there's all sorts of rebuttals for that. The fact that there's, actually an optical nerve or vein running across the lens, which is actually not a great design. But for me, I'll leave all that biology stuff to them. For me, the perfect example is like you've got eyelashes, right? And their job is to keep debris out of your eyes and dust, but the motherfuckers fall into your eyes all the time. Like, how is that a good design, right? Like, when's the last time you're walking through, these eyelashes save me from dust? No, it just like falls off into your eye every time. Like I wake up and I always have eyelashes in my eyes. It's terrible.
I was going to say, I don't think the eye is actually really that great a design. There's so many videos on YouTube where they show how much the eye actually fails in terms of peripheral vision, and
got blind spots,
they'll do a lineup of cheerleaders to a bunch of college frat boys, and then they'll show cheerleaders in the middle, and then they'll say, which one do you reckon's the most attractive? And then these frat boys are picking like some bloke that they've put a dress on.
Oh man, we probably should get into it. Andy, what are we talking about today?
Kids. Should we have them? Do they make a life better? Who should care for them? Whose responsibility they are?
This should be an easy episode. Things. We're both family men. We both have kids collectively.
And you just recently have had a very new kid.
Yeah, that's right. A couple of weeks old. Still has that patina on it. Let's start at the start. And with a big question around, do kids make our life better off? What do you think are the reasons for having kids? What are the motivations people have?
I think there's a big weight of social norms saying that this is what you do. And by definition, we all are children, and most of us are fortunate enough to grow up in families and in some environment where there are kids around. And we look at our parents and guardians and we see that as very, very normal. So it's actually the default position, right? That you've got to... So
you're saying it's perpetuated by your own upbringing?
Yeah, it's the thing you do because you just, that's what you do. You follow in the footsteps of, you go, well, what am I supposed to do in this life? Well, of course I have kids. That's the thing you do. That's probably the predominant reason, frankly, that most people have kids. But
so not really a reason at all then, you think? Not a conscious reason that they sit down and say, I want kids because of X, Y, Z. It's just you get married
and you have kids. And if you don't do that, it's more that you're the exception. And I think that's actually probably the case for most families. Most children are born in that sort of general situation. But I'm actually really interested in the marginal cases. So that the people who are actually consciously and thoughtfully engaging in the question, should I have kids or not? And they're actually thinking about it as it's a line ball decision. Like they're actually making a very conscious decision whether to do it or not. I think that's where the really interesting discussion is to be had.
So I agree that a huge chunk of the population probably doesn't really think about it. It's just a want in the background because of the societal norms, the inertia, their own upbringing. But there are people who do try to take a more rational and logical approach to this. Get, the yellow legal pad out and do the pros and cons list.
The problem with this approach is, how do you really know what the costs and benefits are? Because you can't know in advance, right? So you've got this concept called the vampire problem. Is it good to be a vampire? We see it as like, of course you wouldn't want to be a vampire. Why would you want to be a vampire? But like, hang on, there must be some like good parts to being a vampire.
I mean, we both watched Blade. Obviously, there are some upsides.
And they live very long lives, and blood tastes really good. Garlic, not so much, but we can't know what it's like to be a vampire, right? So we don't know whether it would be good or bad. And I think that's very similar to the situation of being a parent. You can look at the things that in advance that you think are good, like cute little babies and stuff, but you maybe don't see, but like sleepless nights and expensive bassinets and clothes and going to the hospital at 3 a.m. because they've got like a little bit of a temperature and you're not sure what to do. All the other palaver, come with
I'm
kids.
sick of being taken advantage of by big bassinet. I think with something both you and I have experienced, babies are life's ultimate puzzle. All the books in the world aren't going to help you. And you just have to, try and see. It's the biggest experiment. When they're crying, you don't know what's wrong. They can't tell you. They could be hungry, gassy, bored, or just even suffering through the pain of existence. And I think every new parent has that experience of this alarm going off and not knowing the code. So it's impossible to know your child. It's that a priori knowledge. You have to learn it by going through it, not just surmising it. I remember growing up, I didn't really have pets, but then one day when I was a teenager already, a bird flew into our yard, and it was obviously a tame bird. It was a cockatiel, and then it became our pet. And I remember just really worrying about this freaking bird. It was really a bit of a lesson in the fact that when you care about something, it does make you vulnerable, stressed out about it because you care about so much.
The question, how should you decide whether to have kids or not? We can't really know in advance, right? It's this gamble you've got to take if you're game. I did recently read a book called Wild Problems by Russ Roberts, and he had this really great anecdote in there, and I think it's probably a popularized one, but like Charles Darwin, he's got this list of the pros and cons of getting married, and the cons of getting married, like no longer free to go wherever you liked, no longer can enjoy the conversation of clever men at clubs, you'll be forced to visit relatives and to bend to every trifle, to have the expense and anxiety of children, loss of time, cannot read in the evenings, fatness and idleness, less money for books.
Oh my God.
But on the pro side, for getting married, that is, he had a constant companion, object to be beloved and played with, better than a dog anyhow.
Such a romantic.
Someone to take care of the house, charms of music and female chit-chat.
See, this is the thing though, right? If you were to obviously produce a list like that, you'd be seen as someone on the spectrum or just some weirdo, right? But really that's what's going on behind the scenes. And in other cultures, it is a little bit more overt. Like, have you ever seen that Chinese dating show? Oh, it's brutal.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like, they're very overt and very blunt around why they're not suitable or what they want. And in some ways, we're not used to that in Western relationships and dating, but around the world, it's a different attitude towards that.
So we've talked about pros and cons, and we've talked about deciding before the fact whether you should or shouldn't become a parent. How do you feel after you've entered the new world of parenthood? You can't go back.
The vast majority of people, after they've had kids, will often say that even though it's hard, it is the best thing they've ever done in their life. It's the most rewarding thing. And this cuts across people who are super successful and those who aren't, or who have nothing going in their lives, to everything under the sun going on in their lives. And I think that it does change you. Part of me, when I originally heard that before kids, I was very much like, it's probably kind of like a wedding day, like you spend so much money and you're so committed that you just have to tell yourself that it's worth it. Otherwise you'd go mentally insane. But obviously after being a parent, there is absolutely something that changes in your mind. And I think there's been a lot of people that have tried to describe it. Someone said to me a little while ago, I really like the idea, is that having kids is the only way to live forever. And that's a really interesting concept, right? But there are a range of other reasons too that are a little bit darker, and society doesn't really, you don't really want to say them out loud. Some people want kids because they don't want to be alone, and they want actually to make a companion for themselves that will look after them in old age. I think back in history, there's been much more economic reasons to have kids, in terms of running the family business or the farm. Now, on the other side of why people don't have kids, there's a tendency to assume if someone doesn't have kids, maybe they can't have kids, they tried and they failed, or there's just never met the right partner. whatever it is, it's quite hard for society to really accept that some people just don't want them, hands down. Even harder if you're a woman.
So with kids, like, they obviously give you like a lot of benefits, right? You have those moments you feel proud of kids, you have a lot of fun with them, they laugh, they smile, you enjoy watching them grow, they can wipe your ass when you're 85.
80's the new 60, man.
Elon Musk probably has a solution to that problem. But you have a situation where there are actually all these real benefits, but like, it's the costs though, not in dollar terms, just the stress, and you don't have any time for yourself. And the thing that I find particularly interesting is, how do you reconcile the daily struggles of parents, right? And you talk to your colleagues and they're like, oh, they have to take days off because their kids are sick. They have to leave work because of X, Y, and Z calamity, running their kids around to, all these different extracurricular activities. And it's just this nightmare of a life that they have. How do you reconcile that with that they all report, oh, it's the best thing I've ever done?
And there's that kind of narrative that's out there. And I think that's changing. It was definitely like that for our parents, right? You couldn't dare complain about your kids because they're a blessing. But I feel like our generation is starting to move a little bit away from that. We value a little bit more rawness and authenticity. And so it's much more common to hear people talking about the realities of it, whether it's childbirth and how hard that is on women and how hard it is to carry pregnancies, but also the realities of parenting a young child. And I actually, when people ask me, I don't sugarcoat it anymore either. I talk about the sleep deprivation and how it's very challenging to do it well.
That's an interesting comment you made around not sugarcoating things.
Yeah.
There are some ways that I felt underprepared as a parent. So where I had in my mind what I thought it would be like. I've got one child, right? So I've only been through an experience where I've gone from 0 to 1, right? And I felt like that's actually 0 to 100 because
1,000.
a million. And, it gets like way easier over time. But that first shock of that first, oh my God, like you mean I can't sleep? I didn't go into it thinking that I would get 8 hours of sleep, but I wasn't expecting to be waking up probably every 45 minutes. And that's a thing that you just have to get used to.
No matter how bad it is, it's always the best thing in the world. If you look at it objectively, I understand exactly what you mean.
So much of this can probably be explained by differences in the experiencing self versus the remembering self. Mm. So how do you actually assess sort of happiness or welfare and well-being? One of the ways you can do it is you can report your general level of happiness. Non-parents are generally happier and more satisfied at that time, on average, than parents actually are. So the experiencing self, being the person at that time when you ask them, is finding the experience of being a parent quite hard.
Yeah.
But then when you ask the alternative approach or methodology you could do to assess these sorts of questions is to ask people at a point in time, how satisfied are you with your life overall? Not right now, but like overall, including past, present, future. And parents generally give fairly positive answers to those questions. And I think part of that must be, you made a comment around it's the way to prolong yourself. It interacts with something else other than your hedonistic at that time moment.
Yeah, it makes you think longer term too. So I think legacy is a very important part of that, right?
So just changing tack a little bit, is it ethical to have kids? I stopped having kids because I'm afraid of climate change. I'm a little bit upset that you haven't joined me.
Can't help it, it's that Genghis Khan in my blood.
I saw this group, they call themselves birth strikers. So they're actually actively out there deciding that they won't have kids because they're worried about climate change, and they do all the media rounds and they express how anxious they are about the future, and they're not having kids. And it just made me think of a movie called Idiocracy, where the premise of it is that basically smart people decide that it's not a good idea to have kids. And so none of them have kids. And then you're just left with a bunch of idiots and the world descends into chaos. Whereas actually they should be saying, no, we should procreate really quickly because we need to cultivate socially conscious human beings so that they can propagate socially conscious ideas and strategy.
Factor, right? That's why he's having, just had 20 kids or something from surrogates because he's trying to live by those standards as well. I think when it comes to ethics, there's definitely an angle there that gets thrown around about the environmental impact. And I've seen very conflicting things on this. So, for example, If you type into Google, you'll find a fair few articles claiming that having one less child is the equivalent of 7 times the next 10 most impactful mitigants in terms of a carbon footprint.
That you can do as an individual, right?
That's right. And that's pretty shocking, right? But then when you actually think about the consumption of a human being, it's not very surprising. They'll grow up and they'll travel, they'll have their cars, or do whatever they need to do. Then there's also another school of thought that actually says that that number of 7 times is grossly over exaggerated because it looks at today's carbon footprint for an individual. It doesn't take into account some of the policies that we are implementing as a society. So actually going green, going to electric cars and mandating them, that's going to significantly reduce a carbon footprint for an individual if we manage to go neutral in a lot of our industries. So I think that when I step back, I'm kind of neither here nor there on the whole child and environmental piece.
But some of these climate change arguments are pretty bullshit though, really, because like, of course, that's going to be the biggest thing you can do to mitigate it. But that's not really the point. Why is climate change the number one factor we should be considering whether having a kid is ethical or not? To me, it just seems like such a nth order degree factor we should consider, because if you balance up the marginal extra contribution of a person to climate change against the benefits of living and their positive experiences. I mean, isn't one of the reasons we actually care about climate change is because we care about people and because we care about the lives that people live? For us not to look at the well-being of a human, I mean, that's almost like saying let's kill people because we're concerned about climate change.
I agree. It's a very narrow lever to kind of pull and a metric to use around climate change. Something that happened to me last week while I was thinking about this episode is I was getting a treatment by a Chinese kind of therapist. And as he was doing it, he was talking to me about growing up in China. We had this hilarious conversation about, because he knows that we've just had a little girl and he's talking about me. It was a very hard conversation because he didn't speak much English and there was a bit of a lost in translation. And you can only ask someone to repeat something so many times before you just have to nod your head and just try your best to get along with the conversation. But he was trying to say, he's like, no, you need to, your wife breastfeeding, you need to go get chicken. Not Cole's chicken, too young. You need to go to find old mountain chicken. It's hilarious. So there is this thing in Chinese culture where you make this chicken broth with the ginger and it's meant to really help the wind of the mother and not passing that on to the baby and all sorts of things. But he was talking to me about the one-child policy. And this is kind of very relevant for this question because this is how the thinking leads, right? It's saying that we're overpopulated. The impact to, say, food sources and other resources is going to result in all these negatives for our country. And they implemented this policy. And I really think this is when you try to control something as fundamental and natural as growing a family and the decisions around that, you can lead to some serious unintended consequences and a whole lot of misery. Hearing him talk about it and the impact it's had on his family and his relatives is shocking. We've got generations now where a generation of single kids looking after 2 parents and then 4 grandparents, all that pressure, their lives aren't really theirs, not to mention the impacts on slowing growth, these little emperor syndromes and everything. And I just feel like this kind of thinking around ethics of actually having a kid, something as natural as choosing to grow a family, is a very dangerous road to go down.
So I think a lot of the people who get themselves in a tiz about population growth is that they sort of extrapolate global population growth over, say, the last 50 years and go, oh, well, we've gone from like 2 billion to, or whatever the actual figures are, to 7 billion. So, and we're just going to keep going up at that pace. But they do expect global population to peak at around just under 11 billion around the turn of the century, so around 2100. You can argue, oh, well, how can you can't project anything out to that level. But I think when you look at some fundamental changes in society, economically, we are quite different. We're not tending to farms where we need more people to work the land as we did, which may have been a motivation over many other times in history. We have a lot of developing countries now transitioning into higher income status, and our lives are fulfilled by other things. So we have contraception. So these are all things that mean that I don't think we need to be quite as worried about population growth.
Yeah, I think like they have a quote when the best contraceptive is economic development. And that tends to follow for a lot of the reasons you talked about.
So you mentioned the one-child policy in China. It made me think of during the Great Leap Forward in the late 50s and early 60s, they had the 4 Pests campaign, and they got all the people to go and kill sparrows, and they exterminated all the sparrows to near extinction, except they forgot that, or they didn't realize that the sparrows actually ate all of these insects. Then all of those insects bred and ate all the crops, and there were famines as a result.
Man, this is the problem, right? We are not smart enough to understand the impact of our actions, the consequences of our actions. Every time we try to do something big like that and mess with this complex thing called an ecosystem, bad things happen.
What should we be thinking when it comes to the number of people we have on the planet, and what is going to leave us better off overall?
Obviously, as you know from my one-child policy comments, I think that when it comes to the choice around reproduction and families, that is something that should be a right that is unalienable. That's a liberty that's never taken away.
Net well-being from living or existing is positive on average in most cases. For most people and most normal lives, it's possible to benefit from being alive and having made that journey of birth and through to death. So with that assumption in mind, if we want to maximize total well-being in society, we should have as many possible people alive over the course of the totality of human history as possible. So you get this thing called the repugnant conclusion, which is where we look at all of these things like climate change and the environment, and that we live on top of each other, and like this. Can you imagine the cities we would live in if we had unlimited number of people? But that this world, this horrific dystopian world, is a better scenario from a welfare and an ethics point of view than one where we try and deliberately limit the size of our population for an ethical reason like climate change. So what do you reckon about that?
It's interesting though, right? Because, even if you take that person who's stacked on top of each other and starving and all this kind of stuff, yeah, they are still alive. And if you offered to put them out of their misery, then there and then they'd probably say no. And I think there's also, just to throw in there's this idea that we're overpopulated. And I think that's a very simplistic view of the current state of affairs. It's more about our refresh rate as a population. And I think that is heading for big changes as we develop and as countries change. There's usually a spike as countries become into more wealth, and there's still that high birth rate, but that dies off, no pun intended. There's also this idea, I heard it in a show called Firefly, and there's a couple on board this plane, right, this spaceship, and the woman wants to have kids and the man is not keen because I don't know if this is the right environment to bring kids into this world, in the life that we lead. And the woman says a really good quote on it. And she says, we can't be so scared that we're going to lose something that we never try to get it in the first place. And I think that's kind of similar with this idea with kids, and bringing them into this world. I don't think that we can just stop the story from even starting just because we're worried about the ending, because life is a journey and there's so many twists and turns and no one can predict anything.
And kids are like pretty cute, right?
They got them big eyes. They have to be cute, right, from an evolutionary perspective, otherwise they
get eaten.
So I want to ask you a question. Coming back to it, do you think that having kids makes you less selfish? And the reverse question to that, do you think that people start to become more self-centered, the longer they take to start a family?
There are obvious examples where people who don't have kids, and particularly if they're single or they don't live with another person,
often it goes hand in hand, right?
Yeah, like it's their way, and we're creatures of habit, and the older we get, the less we're open to change. So I think it's not so much that they become selfish, but it's just that, no, this is the way you live. Like you have a routine and it's harder to kind of mix it up. I don't think it's actually selfishness, because selfishness almost implies that they only care about themselves. I don't think that's what's going on. So to the question of like having kids, does it make you more empathetic, or does it increase your ability to care about people other than yourself? Well, maybe it does, to the extent that you're forced to, but I'm not sure it changes you as a person. I think you care very much just about yourself every bit as much as you would otherwise. You might care about your child, but I don't think it translates that you also suddenly care about your neighbors and strangers on the street that you don't know otherwise.
Yeah, it might actually do the opposite as you try to protect your family from others. But I guess I probably have a slightly different view on that. I do agree that people become more set in their ways as they get older, but I think that does make you more self-centered because you're thinking about yourself more because you don't have to think about anyone else. So naturally, it makes you more self-serving, self-centered, and a result of that is you're very inflexible. You think about in the office or friends and family, the weirdest people in this life are the ones that are kind of stayed by themselves. People who live by themselves for too long really struggle to then cohabitate with other people because they're just used to having things their way. They're used to doing everything they want and only thinking about themselves. Now, that's maybe an outcome of the design of their life, and that's maybe not their fault, but I think the end result's still the same. There's something fundamental about like the child relationship, right? As soon as you have a child, you're no longer the most important person in your life alone, and you're responsible, right? So the responsibility transfers to the child. It creates this psychological change that's really, really hard to duplicate. There's nothing like that. And I think that change that happens, and especially for men, opens you up to other people. And I think that's why on a deep level that people trust family men more and family people that come from families, because that relatability of understanding what kids are like. And you see this in all parts of life, right? So when you have a childless friends versus friends that have kids, they are just more empathetic and more understanding when you talk to people without kids. The thing I love is when they try to like relate. They're trying to kind of like join in the conversation, even though they don't have kids. And they use their dog as their kid. And they go, I'm a dog mum, and, I had to train them. And so or they'll come in, they go, I'm just getting his sleep because I'm training my like dog or something like that. And I know it's just a social thing and they're trying to be included in the conversation, but it's also so insulting to compare the training of your puppy to the realities of dealing with a newborn. And it's hilarious. I kind of laugh at it now, but I remember at the time, I'm like, what is this person talking about?
Not to cast aspersions against like the gay community, but often that whole dog parent kind of culture thing, I think is quite prominent. In the unit block where I live, we've got this gay couple.
Really? In the inner city?
And they've got in the hot zone. And they've actually got 2 kids. They're both under sort of 3, I think, a baby and probably a 3-year-old. And my son asked me, how do they have kids? Like, because he's going through his, sex education, all this sort of stuff, right, at school. So how do they have babies?
It's so funny, right? Everyone's got a story, right? So what did you say? I want to tell me what you said to him.
I just said the magic sticks.
Magic stick. Hit you with the magic stick.
But like they probably go through an even more traumatic experience because they have to, it must be very complicated to get surrogacy and, and that's just like another whole other layer of stress. So actually like all credit to them, gay couples who have kids. That's the real deal. Like that's dedication 110%.
It really goes to this idea around how, whether it's biological, whether it's just driven or it's an innate urge that only women have.
Well, men need kids to go get them a beer from the fridge as well, don't they?
No, we watch the ad. That's not a good way to perpetuate the cycle of alcoholism. But yeah, I think that the dog parent thing is hilarious, but also just I think it's an age thing as well, right? Like as I don't expect a 20-year-old to be having, any relatability to babies and things like that, I
guess the other thing on the complete flip side, right? And I think this is quite relevant to a lot of the conversation today where we've sort of framed having kids as a choice, but we've got to acknowledge those people who want kids but can't have them for whatever reason. And you can't assume that because someone doesn't have kids that is a choice. It might be they've struggled to get pregnant in the past. It could be that they just haven't met the partner, but like it's this thing that they're pining for. There's so many like experiences and they're not experiences that you can see, right? They're things that they keep to themselves.
Absolutely. I reserve my judgment for like the young single dog mum or dog father. But I agree. Like, I think that there's this whole thing about the choice, right? Like, there's obviously a subsection of society that just do not want kids, right? For whatever reason. And I feel like it's something that they constantly have to justify. So you decide to grow your family and have a child, but they go into daycare within 4 weeks because you want to continue your career. What are your thoughts on that?
There can be many reasons why people feel they're in that situation. One of them is economic. And I think if it is economic, I wouldn't at all have any, I wouldn't be judgmental about someone in that situation. But I might be judgmental about whether that's a good place to be as a society where that is the case.
Just lean in, buddy.
But that to me does suggest someone's valuing their career more than their family.
And once you miss that time, it's gone. Now, something that is always spoken about when we talk about the modern family and things that were maybe lost by increasing female participation in work is this idea that one partner, one side of the couple can sustain a family in a meaningful way. What is your view of a return to that situation? If we could implement all these policies, and what happens if half the workforce, regardless of gender, stopped working tomorrow? And we had to find a way back to that situation of a household being supported, a family being supported by a one working household.
Well, it's not possible.
What would have to happen for us to return to that reality?
Well, we would have to consume less and we would have to live different lives. We've gone from having a full-time parent at home and one person in the workforce to now 2 full-time income earners as almost like a requirement to sustain a family. And what a travesty things have become that now you really do need 2 full-time incomes to sustain a modern life. But the reality is a modern life is very different to the life that was lived in the 50s.
Is it though?
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. Think about all of the amenities you have available to you. Maybe to put it a completely different way, at the end of the day, if you want to live, like you've said, one income and one person home, you can do that today. You can. It's just you can't live in Sydney. You can't live in a high income area because you can't afford to. So you got to make trade-offs. You've got to live out to the burbs. You've got to live to a regional area. If you want to live in a regional area, you can do it.
Why could they afford to do that in the 50s?
Sydney in the 50s was not Sydney as it is today. So we think of Sydney today as, in the 50s they could live in Sydney. In the 50s, Sydney was the pubs closed at 6 o'clock. So there were no restaurants. There were no avocado on toast in the morning. It was a very simple life, and I think we project our current lives, just some basic stuff. We have in our phone that we carry around with us a camera that they couldn't dream of having. We have information at our fingertips. We just have
the equivalent of that. Their home TVs cost more than our TVs cost today.
You can't compare TV where you might have had 2 or 3 channels to YouTube. You cannot compare. There's no comparison. The quality of our life now, at least in terms of material well-being. Now, I think maybe where you're going, and this is where we can maybe have a discussion, is are we better off as a result? Maybe we're not. But in terms of actual material well-being, we absolutely have far more than we ever could dream. Families did it tough back then. The stories from my parents are things like, we had chicken once a year as a special, like a roast chicken once a year as a special.
Was it a mountain chicken?
A special event, yeah. It was the ones that
old mountain
good
chicken
for breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Things weren't plentiful in the way that they are now. So you can, if you want to sort of live a life where you one parent at home, you can do that. But we don't want to. We want to work. We're educated. We get status from our jobs, our careers. We want to be more than just parents to children. We want to be other things as well. And I think overall we're better off. We're not. I don't think we're worse off. I think in some ways we are worse off. Certainly house price values, we're worse off. So you got to go to the places where they're not bidding up prices, and that's these regional areas and outer suburbs.
Man, I was sure you were going to introduce a one-child policy, but you let me down. Not radical enough.
So just coming back to make kids, you need the ingredients, the magic ingredients of kids, the magic sticks.
So on a different note, Andy, I heard this joke. Do you want to hear it?
I'm not a bit scarred after the last one.
This one, all right, I can't take credit for this one, and nor do I want to, but I'll just give it to you anyway. I heard it this week. So why isn't there a pregnant Barbie doll?
Well, I don't think she's got any internal organs.
Maybe. Or it could be that it's because Ken came in a different box.
I'm not quite sure Ken is
Capable.
of that inclination anyway, is
You
he?
don't know that. He could be a grower, not a shower. It could be there, but it just needs the right kind of, intense concentration.
So we've talked about housing and all those other things. Is it easier to meet people today or is it harder?
I think the answer to that question is that it's easier to meet people, and that's why it's harder. And so this is obviously about the new style of dating, which we're both lucky enough to somewhat emerge from unscathed. But from all accounts, I think that the traditional kind of way of courtship and how people settle down absolutely has changed with the times, and it does make it a bit harder to get to that commitment. I think it's the perfect storm of how modern dating and dating apps have really changed the landscape, introduced a lot more choice, made encounters a lot more transactional, coupled with how careers and both learning and the starting of commencing your career is taking a lot longer. It's not uncommon to go to uni for the better part of a decade almost, and then really only join the workforce as you're starting to turn that corner into your late 20s, 30s. I think all of that puts strain on this idea of having a big family. So yeah, I do think it's harder to get to that point nowadays.
What do you think the problem is that people keep swiping? What's the direction? Is it left is the bin or right is I?
Man, I don't want to know. So there's two things I personally think. I think it's a bit of a FOMO culture. It's a fear of settling when there's something better out there. That's one part. And then I think the rest is more about, I feel like if you're in an environment where there's so much change and nothing is dependable and you're geared up for the harsh reality of rejection, you kind of close yourself off. There are defense mechanisms that you deploy out there to kind of tell yourself you don't really want it. You don't want anything serious because you know that it's going to be really hard to get that and you'll probably be hurt and rejected. And you see that play out in a lot of ways, right? And I think that those two things mash together to make this really low effort, transactional, low investment kind of landscape for dating.
So, there's a formula for what you've just outlined, which is that if you start dating, like, let's say you've got like a period of years that you're actively seeking a partner, that what you should do is first 37% of that dating window, you just reject everyone, right? So you date as many people as you can in that dating window within that first 37%, reject everyone, don't settle down. And then in the remaining period that you have, you double down on the next person you meet that's better than everyone you met in the first 37% of that dating window.
Where did you pick up this strategy?
Mathematically, apparently, that's the optimal strategy.
Like a lot of things, I think you have to find out, right? Any relationship, whether platonic or romantic, they're two humans. You're learning about each other as time goes on. You're learning about yourself. It's a moving target. So I think relationships are always hard, no matter what they are. What gets you through those hard times is the want and the kind of vision as well. And I think that's really changed because of the reasons I mentioned, that people have such low expectations now. They don't want to get hurt, and there's such a brutal landscape through a numbers game that they're less likely to have the vulnerability and commitment that's really needed to take you through those hard times.
But I mean, it can't be a bad thing, right? The effect of apps like Tinder is just that it gives another way of meeting people, right? Tinder hasn't really taken away from other ways people might meet, like at school or through, friend of a friend, or at work, even in Harvey Weinstein's office, or whatever. Like, these are all ways you can meet people, and they haven't gone away because of Tinder. It's just that Tinder's this extra thing. And I guess there's a subset of people who are psychologically, that it can rewire their brain and they can become, oh no, I've got to just keep swiping, and oh no, I can never settle down. And there's probably also people who, through the process of it, get hurt or whatever, and then it has a feedback loop. But I don't know, I just sort of wonder, like, I'd love to see if there's data on to what extent Tinder accounts for marriages. Like, I see these things, like,
they always end up married, so it must work. I think there's a counter view to this through the sexual revolution and things like that. What's happened, especially with the apps, is that it's like a bell curve, right? And you have a top end that is this really highly promiscuous men that are just sleeping with a very large proportion. So the apps have given them access to essentially sleep with a lot of different women that they wouldn't normally in a lifetime get access to. So they're the ones that are creating most of the havoc. But what it does also is actually lift the level of sexuality and promiscuity to their level. So the middle of people who actually just want a pretty standard monogamous long-term relationship are the ones that are displaced on both sides. So it's kind of negatively impacting men and women because it's actually catering towards that really high promiscuity male end. And the tastes are being matched by women because they're chasing after those really perceived high value males. But there's this huge glut in the middle that still want those traditional long-term relationships.
So we should bring back arranged marriage. I spent some time living in China, and one of the really funny kind of almost tourist attraction sites is to go to like the People's Park in whatever city you're in. And you have all these parents on a Sunday morning and they've got A4 signs with the little tags that you can tear off with the phone numbers and a picture of their child.
Oh man,
kids.
Can you imagine your parents marketing you? Like if they were left to their own accord to be like, okay, I'm going to the park, Andy, and I'm going to find you a wife, probably take about a month or two, but I'm going to go out there and, I'm going to market the shit out of you, get you a good one. What would they do?
Would they advertise that you have kids? Is having kids?
It's too late now. In this scenario, you're like you're a virgin.
High sperm count.
Very clean, very clean.
So I just want to ask a question. So you have kids, and fortunately, if you're in a country like the one we live in, there are many services available to you for free, whether it's healthcare, education, childcare, whatever, right? There's all these services that you get and you don't pay for them, or at least the government contributes to you. So my question is, whose responsibility are kids? Should people who don't have kids contribute to the costs of raising other people's kids? Is that fair? Or should parents pay more of their own way?
If it's kind of the general idea of welfare, then yeah, I think that what we have to remember is that these kids are going to grow up and be part of society, right? So the childhood that they go through and they emerge out of on the other side is coming back to the community one way or the other. So I actually do believe that.
But how?
There needs to be a safety
how
net.
does it? But like how? Like just to play devil's advocate, I'm not saying I disagree with you, but if you're someone who's made a decision, no, I don't want to have kids, I don't care about the future, I'm going to die. Like, well, what do I care about the future? I don't have kids. I don't get any of the benefits from having kids. In fact, I don't even like kids.
Mm-hmm.
Why the hell should I have to pay for their education or their care or whatever? Like, how does it benefit? What's the public argument for why we should all pay for kids?
Yeah. So if I'm trying to convince someone who's thinking about themselves in that way, I would say to that person, when you are 60, 70, 80, I'm pretty sure you can be stabbed by a 14-year-old pretty easily. So I think it's the same thing, that the kids are the future generation that will emerge into society. They'll be the ones looking after you, providing essential services. And if you have a population that are disadvantaged and have a traumatic childhood, that's going to essentially ruin the world that you want to live in and the experience of your own thing. You don't exist as an island. You're part of a community. And so while I don't believe that it's directly that person's responsibility, you have to accept the realities. Most inmates have a release date. So do you care what happens to them while they're in jail and rehabilitating? You might say no, but the real answer is yes, because they have to come into contact with you, right? You're part of this world. You're not an island. You can't live in your shitty apartment and keep to yourself all day long. So that's kind of how I would pitch it to someone who's thinking in those more closed-minded, why should I pay for this service or pay for someone else's choices? You already will, whether you like it or not.
That's a little bit like the argument for why we should just generally have any kind of social public welfare programs, because if we don't have some sort of baseline care or support for people, they'll be stealing it from you.
Oh, I used to work with this South African, and it's always funny because they always have very vivid memories of when they migrate. They were showing me pictures of the house they lived in South Africa, and it was this beautiful, gorgeous kind of mansion, and they had lots of money and things. But then they're like, but it had a high walled perimeter around it, barbed wire on top, and they had guards. So even though they were living in a mansion, essentially they were prison walls, and they moved to Australia to essentially be free. So
today we've discussed a lot of different topics, including having kids, how to find a partner, whatever, all these quite complex issues. It still comes back to me like there's no formula to apply, right? That whole 37% thing that's really just absurd, right? No one, I don't think, could seriously be applying that sort of approach. And I think, the same with kids. The Darwin list, there is no cost-benefit analysis that gives you the answer of what you should do. There's no practical value because we can't fully understand what having a kid will be like. We don't know what it'll be for our lives. And the fact that when no parent would look at their child and go, I wish I'd never had, so-and-so. This is just not, you don't hear that. That doesn't happen. There might be some challenges in their life because of having kids, but they'll always love the kid. They'll never regret having that kid.
No one's ever really made mistakes for long.
Clara Hitler.
My view on it too is that the choices around growing a family and to a large extent how you choose to raise that child is very personal and shouldn't be messed with by anyone, let alone governments and other people. So you can throw in all the armchair ethics that you want, but it's really your right. And I'm trying not to sound like a pro-life advocate here, but I believe it's the pursuit of life, and life is a blessing, it's a gift, and it should be seen as that, So I really think that even though there can be ethical arguments on either side and whether your choice to have kids or not can be based in all sorts of different lenses, at the end of the day, all life is precious.
Parents or non-parents each have very good reasons for the decisions they've made, or even if they had a decision in the first place. I think if people are happy with their lives, we said last week, the only difference between you and me is that I believe in one less God than you. Well, maybe in this case, the only difference between you and me is that I want one less child than you.
And, I try not to judge the fact that you're selfish about that at all. Kids are just so brutal, aren't they? Especially when they physically